Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Take a breath, slow like molasses in a Maine winter. Now breathe out, warm like steam rising from a tin mug of cabin tea. We're about to travel back to a time when mattresses were built from straw. Weather forecasts came from your grandmother's elbow, and the sound of a blizzard wasn't filtered through double-glazed windows and central heating, but rather thin canvas, a few crates of flour, and the occasional bleating goat. Imagine you're nestled in the bed of a covered wagon, somewhere in the plains of Nebraska, 1850. There's a storm rolling in. Not your modern-day blip on a weather app kind of storm, no. This is a full-bodied, old-school prairie blizzard. It slices horizontally across the land like time's cold whisper, and all you've got to keep it out is that linen roof and cousin Jedediah sleeping beside you, snoring like a tired ox with sinus issues. The average covered wagon, by the way, had about the same insulation as a damp sock. It was impressive mobile engineering for its time, practical, sturdy, and surprisingly aerodynamic if, say, spirited off course by a double fudge tornado. But warm, not exactly. Now, inside that wagon, it's the middle of the night. The family is bundled up in every scrap of wool they own. Quilts, shawls, even a goose feather bonnet that's been rebranded as a foot warmer. They're layered like historical lasagna. The air is dry and dusty, which seems rude, honestly, because it's also freezing. And outside, the wind howls like an offended cat on opera night. You can hear it through the stretched canvas overhead, a taut, trembling sound, like cloth sighing under the weight of time, each gust curling around the wagon's wooden ribs. It flaps, it groans, it purrs with menace. And when that wind really wants to be heard, it moans across the plains with a pitch that could have earned it a spot in a ghost story, or at least as alto in the great Plains Wind Ensemble. Snow patters against the wagon cover like a scratchy lullaby, 1,000 tiny fists knocking gently on your starch-white roof. Let us in, they seem to say. We bring neither warmth nor mercy, just ambiance. Inside it's dim. The only light comes from the faint glow of embers in the cast-iron box heater, if you're fabulously wealthy enough to have one. Otherwise, you're relying on a tightly covered oil lamp and prayers it doesn't tip over and set the flour rations aflame. The lamp flickers, shadows sway. Your breath fogs the air and lingers briefly in front of your nose, before vanishing like your fond memories of spring. Your mother's knitting in the corner. You can hear the gentle click of needles, a soothing rhythm, like rainfall across tiny pine cones. She's making a scarf for the baby, who is asleep in a makeshift cradle made from a broken potato crate and 2 spare wheels. You told her the baby's not cold, but she insists. This storm, she says, in a whisper that folds into the wind, has teeth. And she's right. Frontier storms were not known for their manners. Temperatures could drop so suddenly your biscuit dough would freeze mid-rise. Folks woke up with snow piled on their blankets, not because they went outside, but because somehow winter had walked through the wall without knocking. Still, there's simmering peace in it all, the kind of cold that reverberates right through your bones, yet reminds you you're still here, warm, safe, wrapped in a wool blanket next to the salted pork barrel. That's how you know you've really made it. And the sounds, oh, the meditative cacophony of pioneer nights, the crackle of ice forming on wooden spokes outside, a horse snorting in its dreams nearby, and the gentle crunch of frost settling on the earth like sugar on burnt toast. A lullaby of windsong and canvas, one that says, "You've come far. Rest now. Tomorrow, it may be 30 miles to the next town or 97 to the next decent coffee. But tonight, you sleep surrounded by stories. And if these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now rest, traveler. The next tale is just beyond the next drift of snow. Snow didn't care that you had an ox to your name and a Bible under your pillow. It came anyway. It snuck in across the plains like the world had left a door open just a bit too long behind itself. 1 minute, soft wind, clear skies. The next, the leading edge of a frosty tantrum with a personality, and not a good one. Snow on the American frontier didn't arrive delicately, like in a storybook. No twinkle-toed flakes catching sunlight in courtly spirals. No, it arrived with all the subtlety of a Methodist preacher giving a sermon on sin. Loud, inevitable, and determined to make sure you felt something. Inside the canvas and wood womb of a covered wagon, the sound of an oncoming blizzard was somewhere between a lullaby and an accusation. Wind moaned through wheel spokes, canvas flap ties slapped against frozen sides, and something, it was never quite clear what, thudded repeatedly on the roof as though trying to knock politely, but with increasing urgency. Perhaps a branch, perhaps Providence, perhaps remarkably, a squirrel with irritated opinions about your parking choices. Life inside the wagon at such times was not unlike living in a vibrating loaf of bread. Picture it, a creaky wooden body, curved overhead ribs made of hickory or oak, and above those, heavy cotton duck cloth thick enough to keep out the sun, most of the rain, and only some of the regrets. The wagon, the Conestoga's modest cousin, often called a prairie schooner by folks who wanted to romanticize the hardship, was not really designed for living. It was a mobile pantry, a rolling tool shed, an oxen-powered hope container. But when the wind began to sound like a choir of wolves practicing their scales, you clambered inside with your people, your quilts, your salted pork, and your best attitude, and you made do. And making do involved layers, wool layers, flannel layers, emotional layers, because no matter how many pairs of socks you'd knitted during the calm months, they were never enough when the storm hit, and your own toes began to resemble small frozen ambitions. Inside the wagon, warmth became its own economy, and children were the nation's gross domestic product. Their small bodies, tucked beside larger ones under buffalo robes or patchwork quilts, gave off the kind of heat that only comes from young metabolisms and unspoken terror. Pillow talk in the wagon was less about dreams and more about logistics. Eliza, your leg's in my rib. Move the beans before we crush them. Is the biscuit tin leaking? Tin. Again? Why is something wet? Sleep came in fits. You'd lie back against a rolled coat, knees tucked up, wind howling like a theological debate outside, and listen to the 1,000 little sounds of life on lockdown. A baby cooing in unconscious protest, a tin cup shifting with the wagon's subtle tremor, Uncle Silas snoring, less a snore, more a lowing, some combination of canyon echo and steam engine remorse. And then naturally, someone would forget to close the soup jar tightly, and you'd wake to find your elbow half submerged in tomorrow's dinner, a moment that taught patience, or more accurately, muffled swearing. Oddly enough, there was a kind of peace to it all, a peculiar rhythm that let you believe you might just weather it, even if the snow outside was currently working on inventing new geometries. You could feel the storm rearranging the landscape, quietly bearing landmark shrubs, politely rephrasing hills with a fresh coat of silence. Out there, horses, shifted in their makeshift shelters, tails turned to wind, steaming in unconscious fellowship with every other stubborn creature on this side of the Mississippi. If the world had to pause, it would at least do so with company. Inside, someone murmured a hymn, not for show, not even aloud really, just a trace of melody curling up like steam into the cold gaps between canvas and spirit. Something comforting, something in 4/4 time. Wood creaked again. A boot rolled. The wind, for just a moment, softened, like it had decided it might be more effective as a whisper tonight. And in that space, with cheeks pressed to flannel and potatoes doubling as foot warmers, a yawn caught hold of the group. One by one, like dominoes, if dominoes had chapped lips and frostbitten optimism. The night hadn't won, not quite, but it was clearly ahead on points. And just as the last lantern went out, someone muttered the question that no one wanted to answer, but everyone dreamed of someday, asking aloud, "Do you think the snow's letting up?" But the wind had other ideas, and its next verse was already tuning up somewhere in the dark. Inside the wagon, time had a peculiar way of slowing down. It didn't stop, not quite, but it swirled, like chimney smoke caught in a low wind, hazy and unsure of what direction to take next. The blizzard outside roared like a jury of cold ghosts disappointed in everyone's life choices. But inside the shelter of the canvas-topped prairie schooner, the sound dulled into a rhythmic hush-patter, not entirely unlike a lullaby sung by a snow-covered bear. The canvas creaked gently overhead, stretched taut by both human hands and a threadbare faith in 19th century stitching. Snowflakes gathered in colonies along the seams, forming little outposts of chill that threatened invasion with every gust. The lantern swayed slightly from the center pole, spilling gold light that flickered against the wooden slats of the wagon's side walls like dancing shadows from another century altogether. The oats, sack-turned pillow beneath Martha's head, rustled as she shifted positions. Her bonnet, having long since given up its job of making her look proper, flopped over her eyes, so she folded it back like the first page of an especially irritating novel. Her younger brother, Eli, was using an empty salt pork barrel as a footrest and debating, for the third time that hour, whether snow could get inside a person's soul. It could, he said, staring up at the dim canvas ceiling, which bore the telltale drip track of a slow leak. If it wants to, snow has no manners. Martha didn't respond. She had tucked herself into a blanket cocoon, woven from equal parts homespun and sheer indignation. The cloth itched worse than a church sermon and offered about the same level of spiritual comfort this particular night. Their mother, Judith, sat near the wagon flap, ladling what could generously be described as stew out of a dented tin pot. This travelling stew, which had featured different combinations of dried beans, bones, and misplaced hope all week, had now taken on a stubborn consistency somewhere between porridge and regret. "You know," she said, as she handed a wooden bowl toward Martha, "President Polk probably never ate squirrel 3 times in a row." Martha peeked one eye open. President Polk also didn't travel the Oregon Trail in a wagon built by a man who once confused varnish with maple syrup, she replied dryly. Judith chuckled and handed Eli his portion, the bowl warm beneath his fingers. "Well, if you'd wanted to stay in Ohio, we could have kept eating butter churned by Aunt Louisa's goat." Eli squinted at her. "Goats don't churn butter." "No," Judith nodded, "but that goat tried harder than your uncle ever has." a beat of silence, and then the wind muttered something unintelligible against the canvas. Perhaps a comment on goat labour, hard to say. For all the fury it had earlier, the storm seemed to be tiring, like a tantrum-prone child finally worn out by its own dramatic flair. Between the three of them and the sound of 7 other wagons arranged in a wobbly circle outside, the shifting of ox hooves, the occasional sharp snort from a mule allergic to its own oats, there was none the less a comforting sort of company. Even the storm, now wheezing instead of whistling, had become part of the group. An uninvited guest, perhaps, but tolerated. Martha sipped the hot stew and willed herself to believe in its restorative properties. It was a good night for stories, she thought, ones told slow and notably exaggerated. Tonight, she decided, the tale would be the one her grandfather used to swear by, the ruinous midday snow squall of 1816, also known as the year summer took a personal day. "You remember Grandpa's snowstorm story?" she asked, her voice softening. Eli perked up, the one where the cows froze standing up playing poker. "That's the one," she smiled. "And the chickens enrolled in knitting school to make their own thermal socks." Judith, half listening, gave them both the familiar motherly side-eye, a gaze capable of communicating 12 emotional states with one eyebrow. "Just make sure you stay wrapped up," she said. "If the snow doesn't get you, the pneumonia will file the paperwork." Outside, the landscape was now quiet, save for the gentle whisper of powdered snow shifting in drifts. In here, the warmth of body heat, bad jokes, and lukewarm stew settled over the family like an old quilt, stitched with both love and complete disdain for winter. The lantern flickered again, as if acknowledging the joke about poultry mittens, and then settled into a steady, sleepy glow. Somewhere out past the wagons, further than the edge of their circle, and beyond the reach of kindling-fed campfires, the storm wandered off to sulk, its white arms rustling trees that couldn't be seen but were definitely there. Martha snuggled farther down into her blankets, just as Eli curled up near the barrel that had now doubled as both footrest and secret cookie jar. Above them, the wind whispered, and then waited. Tomorrow, if the weather allowed, and it rarely asked for permission, there would be the challenge of wagon wheels in ankle-deep snow, discussing whether sleet counts as a sacrament, and the surprisingly passionate debate about whose turn it was to shovel out Henry the Mule. But for now, there was nothing left to do but listen to the quiet. The canvas of the prairie had begun to disappear beneath a soft white hush, and inside the wooden ribcage of the covered wagon, everything slowed down. It wasn't proper silence. That would have required cooperation from the wind, something it refused on principle. Prairie wind had all the manners of a barnyard goat, determined, deaf to complaints, and prone to chewing through your last nerve. Josephus, the de facto patriarch of the wagon, and a man whose beard held more secrets than a toll booth confessional, had declared it a modest snow. This, mind you, was the same man who once called a tornado an irritable breeze with commitment issues. So when he said modest, Matilda, his wife of 30-odd years, and many more even-tempered eye rolls, quietly began rationing the molasses and wrapping the children in anything vaguely blanket-shaped. Blankets, in the 1840s, were not always blankets in the modern sense. A flour sack could be a blanket, an old coat, certainly, a disgruntled shawl that had seen one too many town dances. Perfect. The point was, if it could wrap around a child, or better yet two, it counted. Pioneering was, above all, an exercise in creative ambiguity. The inside of a covered wagon during a prairie blizzard had acoustics like a god-sized snore muffled by wool. The canvas top flapped in slow, rhythmic bursts as though the wagon were breathing, a slow inhale of snow, a resigned exhale of frost. Outside, the snow thickened, each flake joining in a silent conspiracy to erase the border between earth and sky. Mornings had stopped being distinguishable from late evenings. Time became a thing told by the number of beans left in the pot or the precise angle of someone shivering. For example, when Eliza, age 7, keeper of lost buttons and inventor of the pinecone doll, finally stopped asking when they'd reach Oregon, it was sometime between a lot of shivering and maybe we panic a little bit now. Not that there wasn't any entertainment. The dog, Mortimer, a lumpy hybrid of sheepdog, raccoon, and possibly ankle-high bear, discovered snow for the first time and briefly tried to live in it. He departed the wagon in a courageous leap, emitted one joyful yodel, and promptly returned with the speed of a greased pancake, nose crusted in frost and innards full of regret. This amused the children immensely and convinced Mortimer to file future blizzards under Nope. Now, entertainment in adverse weather was mostly handled by storytelling, and in this, Josephus was a master. He'd sit on the edge of a crate marked Buttons and Despair, his voice a steady pitch that could touch the walls of the wagon without straining. Tonight's tale involved a haunted molasses barrel and a mule that could sense lies, which Josephus insisted was based on a deeply troubling personal experience. Whether or not the tale was true, nobody slept until the mule had delivered justice, and the ghost had apologized for the syrupy haunting. Food became ritual. Every morsel prepared with care and consumed with unspoken reverence, as though chewing slowly might warm the soul. Biscuits baked over embers weren't just sustenance. They were tiny, flour-caked prayers. And cider, brewed bold and brown from apples that had travelled thousands of miles in burlap, was more than drink. It was how you remembered sunshine. Evenings folded into each other, wrapped in the muffled hum of wind and dreams worn soft at the edges. You could hear the snow if you listened hard enough. It wasn't loud in the conventional sense, but persistent. A kind of gentle, icy whisper repeating over and over, "Slow down, hush now, you're not going anywhere fast." And the wagon, wise in its creaking joints and iron bolts, agreed. Matilda would hum occasionally, a tune her mother used to sing when the hearth was wood-fired, and grandmothers wore aprons that doubled as notebooks. It had no words, which made it perfect for singing while unsure whether your toes still existed. Her voice, a wispy alto with the confidence of sagebrush, floated just above the crackle of the snow lantern, warm and oddly dignified, like a lullaby performed by someone who had seen things. And yet, she sang it as promise, as comfort, as proof that even in the great white somewhere, there was rhythm and there was hope. Outside, the blizzard hadn't tired. Snowbanks curled higher, forming shimmering dunes that licked at the wagon's undercarriage, as if testing its resolve. Inside, they slept in a pile of limbs and quilts and wishes for a warmer tomorrow. And above them all, the canvas ceiling whispered forward, blown gently by a wind that knew how to keep secrets. The wind, to the untrained ear, might have sounded like a series of far-off whispers lost in an argument with themselves. But inside the covered wagon, where canvas flapped like a disgruntled curtain trying to make a point, the blizzard became a different sort of creature. A moody one, with a preference for dramatic entrances and a flair for icy monologues. Martha Dunnigan pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, which was much like fighting off a grizzly bear with a stern look, it did little to halt the inevitable. The fabric of the wagon's cover snapped and groaned as even the seams were voicing their weather-related grievances. Her husband, Silas, sat nearby on a pile of cornmeal sacks, wearing 3 shirts and a philosophical expression, which grew increasingly popular among frontier men when they had absolutely no idea what to do. "Sounds like it's fixing to eat the oxen," Martha said, her voice muffled by the steam of her breath. Silas nodded slowly. "Better the oxen than me." She would have smirked, if not for the icicles forming on the end of her eyelashes. The frost had crept its way past the flaps and through the wooden slats, coating corners of the wagon as neatly as if nature had decided this covered contraption needed a little decorative sparkle. Meanwhile, young Henry, their middle child and seldom the source of silence, was folded like a jackknife in the corner, eyes wide in wonder. Not fear exactly. It was mostly wonder, with a hint of suspicion that the storm might knock on their canvas door at any moment and ask, politely, to borrow some salt. "You think snow's got a sound?" he asked into the white noise. Martha shrugged. "It's got 1,000 of them. Depends how close you are to the stove." Now, the truth was, the average pioneer stove was not equipped to fight a Great Plains blizzard. It could warm a coffee pot, singe your eyebrows, and occasionally set an ambitious biscuit on fire. But keeping an entire family warm while 30-degree winds screamed like opera divas was not in its job description. Still, in the spirit of both survival and optimism, Silas busied himself feeding the tiny stove with kindling as reverently as a priest lighting a candle. Every pop of a burning twig was a small victory, an act of frontier defiance against the meteorological mayhem outside. Outside, the oxen, named Hamlet and Horace, because Martha believed even beasts of burden should sound educated, had been blanketed, fed, and thoroughly insulted by the weather. One could almost hear them, sighing between grunts, rethinking their life choices, and wondering if they'd somehow missed applying for positions pulling carts in Tuscany. Inside the wagon, their hoofbeats clopped dully beneath the snow-dampened silence. For entertainment, which was in drastically short supply, Martha began reading aloud from the family Bible, not for scripture, but for spice. Her voice traced over genealogies with dramatic flair. "And Mahalalel begat Jared," she intoned, with the cadence of a woman spinning a ghost story. Henry gasped appreciatively. "Who's Jared?" he asked. "A man whose name sounds like he could sell sandwiches but never will," Silas replied, earning a rare muffled giggle from the children under their shared quilt. Each gust of wind felt like the earth herself exhaling sharply. There were cracks in the wagon's boards where snow had found its way in, forming tiny drifts under the boots. Time moves slowly under such conditions, so slowly that the hours stretched out like lazy cats in the sun, except there was no sun. Only whiteness pressing against the low ceiling of the prairie sky, and the occasional alarming creak of a tree wishing it had been made of firmer stuff. Supper became a humorous process. Salty jerky had to be sawn in half with a sharpened spoon. Hardtack sparked speculation about whether rocks might in fact be softer on the teeth. For dessert, someone found 2 raisins in the bottom of a flour barrel. They were ceremoniously split 5 ways and consumed with the reverence usually reserved for hosting nobility or finding an indoor bathroom. At last, the fire gasped into dull red embers, and the family burrowed together tighter beneath their bedding. The blizzard howled with less vigor now, as though it had worn itself out from all that grandstanding. Somewhere nearby, Horace snorted in his sleep, the sound surprisingly tender, and slowly the wagon quieted. The creaks softened. The wind lost its appetite. All that remained was the rhythm of sleepers and the soft flutter of something new. Silence, with snow. Tomorrow would begin, not in dread, but with the slow, curious unravelling of white-blanketed morning. And not far outside the wagon, a peculiar set of tracks had begun to bend along the edge of the frozen world. Far out across the yawning prairie, somewhere between a field of brittle corn stumps and a willow tree that had seen better months, the wind stirred up with the grace of a drunk fiddler. It started slow, just a whisper over the browned grass. But inside the covered wagon, it already felt like someone had opened nature's creaky door and let all the cold in for tea. Caroline pulled the buffalo hide tighter over her shoulders, making a little cocoon against the wooden ribs of the wagon. She was 11, which in pioneer years meant she was roughly middle-aged. Outside, the prairie wind whipped in long, moaning harmonies, curling through cracks in the canvas like it had read a book on minor chords and wanted to try composing. Her father, Jedediah, who insisted on being called Captain, despite no military experience and an unfortunate squirrel incident involving a tin whistle, sat just at the front bench, holding the reins with the ceremonial stiffness of a man pretending not to be frozen solid. "Storm's knocking, Jed," Ma said, sitting by the tiny cast-iron stove bolted to the wagon floor. It emitted the kind of heat you could almost remember, if not exactly feel. "I heard it," said Captain Jedediah, nodding solemnly. "I told it to wipe its feet, but it ain't listening." Indeed, the wind had moved in for the evening and brought its entire extended weather family. There was Gust, the cousin who slammed every door, Sleet, who always arrived early and uninvited, and of course, Great Aunt Blizzard, whose idea of hospitality involved thick veils of sideways snow and unsettling silences between louder bursts. Outside, flakes began tapping at the stretched canvas above them, soft at first, like 1,000 lazy moths, then faster, more insistent, as if the sky had gotten itself a drum kit and picked up a caffeine habit. Each gust of wind bundled icy particles into swirling little tantrums. The prairie grass bowed under it, creating shifting patterns like a cold sea, if the sea were extremely shallow and made of sticks. Inside, the lantern flickered, painting gentle shadows onto the canvas walls. The children passed round a tin mug of sassafras tea, which tasted like root beer had forgotten how to have fun. Aunt Hester was darning a sock by candlelight, muttering about how they didn't need all 5 toes anyway, not in times like these. "The wind ain't so bad," she murmured, although she'd tied her bonnet directly over her ears like some sort of makeshift thermal helmet. "Reminds me of when we wintered just outside Dodge. 37 blizzards in a fortnight, 'fore we even had breakfast." No one quite knew where Dodge was, or if Hester had ever actually been there, but her stories were intoxicating in the same way that warm molasses is, thick, confusing, and best in small doses. Meanwhile, the smell of baking cornbread crept out from the tiny stove, a modest triumph. Ma had managed to wrangle a batter from roughly a teacup of meal, a whisper of lard, and the bold optimism of someone who'd sworn she packed more supplies than she did. The scent hung in the wagon like hope with a crust. Caroline leaned closer. "You think the oxen are okay?" she asked softly. Their 2 beasts, Goethe and Butterscotch, were tethered under the lean-to, snuggled into piles of hay, and a firm belief that tomorrow would be warmer. "They'll be fine," Ma said, though she sounded exactly like someone who had no idea how oxen felt about wind chills and the existential dread of livestock. Goethe, named for reasons no one remembered, was the philosophical ox. He stared into snowstorms as though pondering their metaphors. Butterscotch liked licking icicles. They were a balanced team. Outside, the storm swelled a little more. Teeth of cold lashed at the wagon covering, and the thumps and whispers rose into a symphony of numbness. But inside, Clara hummed to herself, sewing another patch onto the family quilt, a blue one with the tiniest scrap of sky she could remember from summer. And the quilt, hand-stitched and wonkily charming, slowly stretched across the laps of the family as they huddled in the makeshift warmth. Patchwork stars, faded plaids, and one dubious square made from an old pair of underbreeches. The storm hollered and moaned, as blizzards do when no one listens. But inside, over the clinking of a tin spoon and the gentle creak of wagon wood, a kind of peace settled in, old and slow. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote yawned. Snow piled against the wheels like sugar drifted by an unsteady baker. And as the tiny stove gave its last, spirited hiss, and the lantern finally gave up its flicker, silence folded itself into the canvas seams. Tomorrow, they'd check the wagons, and Goethe might have opinions. But for now, the world slowed, tucked in under frozen clouds and sky-wide hush. And just as little Caroline's eyes began to close, a faraway sound stirred, hooves, faint and gentle, crunching the snow like whispered footsteps from another wagon, or perhaps something a bit older than even Captain Jedediah's joke about unbuttered cornbread. Out on the frozen belly of the prairie, time itself seemed to slow to a polite shuffle. There were no clocks in the covered wagon, of course, just the occasional creak of timber or the soft groan of a wheel axle protesting another night served up by winter's icebox. Inside the wagon, the cold had become almost a character in the cast. Silent, stoic, and deeply committed to method acting. It curled into every seam of stitched canvas, whispered beneath the buffalo hide blankets, and peered with quiet curiosity at the steaming lips of a tin mug being passed hand to hand. Tonight's entertainment, as it was most nights of the blizzard stay, came by way of candlelight and stories. Pioneer stories, handed down like well-worn mittens, too big at first but warm in the right places. There were tales of other winters, some survived, some exaggerated, and a few heroically outwitted by little more than boiled cornmeal and high spirits. Father, of course, was the perennial narrator, his beard now crystallized with the dainty lacework of his own breath. He referred to it as his face scarf, and insisted it was the height of frontier fashion. Now, when I was your age, he began, firmly cementing his status as the evening's designated oracle. We'd walk 10 miles through the snow just to collect the mail. Little Annie, all of 7 and currently wearing 3 socks on each foot, blinked up from beneath her blanket fort, unimpressed. Was it uphill both ways? Indeed it was, he grinned, and I had to negotiate a treaty with 2 warring squirrels just to pass through the pine woods. The children giggled, the laughter fogging up the wagon canvas, along with the steam from the evening stew. Beans, mostly. Always beans. A sonic risk in close quarters, yes, but in the absence of entertainment, even gastrointestinal percussion had comedic value. As snow pelted and padded against the wagon's stretched hide, it produced a calming rhythm, like a polite audience clapping in mittened appreciation. Outside, the wind yawned and exhaled across the plains, dragging drifts into lazy dunes that settled, reformed, and settled again. If snow had a voice, it would surely have been a baritone lullaby, reciting long-forgotten ballads with closed eyes. Inside, Mother busied her hands with mending, and not only socks. She was the quiet glue in the cabin on wheels, sewing more than just holes. She stitched tension into square corners, tucked anxieties into neat seams. Her fingers knew the way around a dropped hem and a dropped spirit just the same. The dog, Gumption, so named for his famous lack of it, had finally committed to a single sleeping position after rotating himself no fewer than 4 times around the same woolen mat. He gave a conclusive sigh, possibly from existential exhaustion or the bean stew, and lowered his snout to his paws. Edgar, the oldest sibling, lay belly up on the wooden plank bed frame, fashioned from scrap lumber and the mutual agreement not to move suddenly. He kept a dull pencil tucked behind one ear and had taken it upon himself to start a nightly logbook. Meteorological observations and other boring yet brag-worthy details. Today's entry read simply, "Colder than an ex-wife's handshake. Blizzard persists. Lost 1 boot. Found boot. Lost it again." But he liked writing. It gave shape to their days and dulled the corners of restless thoughts. It was easier to face the next frozen sunrise if you had just explained the last one to the edge of a page. And so, time wandered on in the little floating world of canvas and wool, as layered and swaddled as the people inside it. The horizon had vanished beneath white, and the road ahead was just a promise waiting under snow. In the stillness, the wind retreated, tucking itself into snowbanks like a weary traveller. The blizzard had not gone, but it had become familiar, like the tick of a clock you don't hear until it stops. Outside, something shifted. A tiny crack of light peeked under the wagon flap, and the unmistakable sound of silence. Not the threatening kind, no, the thoughtful kind. The sort that suggests something might have just changed. It was Edgar who reached for his pencil again, squinting into the chimney of pre-dawn stillness. Tomorrow's entry, it seemed, would have something new to say. The biscuits had frozen. Not the fresh, pillowy kind, either. These were hard-tack discs the consistency of roofing tile, practically built to defy human teeth, and yet, with the temperature now well below reason and sanity, even they managed to turn stiffer than their usual indestructible selves. Somewhere along the Kansas prairie, beneath a mound of snow that fluttered and whispered like feathers on canvas, a family of 5 tried their very best not to notice. Inside the wagon, sleep came in intervals, like a lazy train schedule in winter. Under quilts sewn from flour sacks and patched petticoats, the children curled like cats, their noses poking into the warm pockets under arms or against a sister's knobby knee. The father, a man named Silas, with a beard shaped like a disappointed broom, sat hunched at the front, wrapped tight in a buffalo hide, and the stubborn belief that this would all be worth it come spring. Spring, after all, was just a few eternities away. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate the profound optimism of the 19th century mind. Imagine choosing to pack your entire life into a wooden rectangle on wheels covered only by canvas and hauled across mountains, rivers, and existential despair, all in the hope that somewhere west, apples the size of melons waited for you to pluck them with your hopeful, frostbitten hands. Outside, the blizzard sang in 1,000 tongues, the wind howling low like a cello with bronchitis, the sleet rat-a-tatting on the canvas like 1,000 bored woodpeckers tapping out Morse code, and snowflakes danced in little eddies under the wagon, gathering in drifts that quietly plotted to swallow the wheels whole. Nature, it seems, has a flair for the dramatic. But inside the wagon, there was a kind of stillness, the kind particular to people surviving rather than thriving. The mother, Eliza, stirred the dregs of a kettle over a pocket-sized ember that called itself a fire with undue confidence. A stew made mostly of melted snow and onion peels simmered in grudging cooperation. They called it supper. In truth, it was merely heat in a cup. They'd stopped travelling when the snow made it clear it was not taking requests. The oxen, half statue by now, stood with frosted eyelashes and an air of bovine resignation. One of them, Horace, developed the habit of chewing cud very pointedly every time someone suggested pushing forward. Historians suspect this was sarcasm. Let's talk briefly about wagon insulation, or rather, the stunning lack of it. The canvas cover served not as an actual barrier to the cold, but as a suggestion. It was cold resistant in the same way a teacup is flood resistant. Drafts snuck in from every corner, battling for dominance like tiny, invisible brawlers with icicle daggers. It wasn't so much sleeping as holding very still and pretending you weren't freezing to death with loved ones. And yet, like all great adventures, there was a rhythm to the hardship. The family told stories. The youngest, Josie, asked again for the tale of the raccoon that got tangled in the wash line back in Missouri. Her brother Sam, sniffling with an impressive icicle forming near his left nostril, obliged. Their voices were a comfort, echoing low against the canvas like lullabies in a wintry cathedral. Meanwhile, Eliza hummed old songs she only half remembered, the notes curling around the wagon's frame like wood smoke, sweet and sad. Songs she'd learned from her own mother, whose memories smelled like apples and camphor. Somewhere close to midnight, the wind pulled back for a breath, and the silence outside was so complete it throbbed in the ears. That was when Silas nudged open the canvas flap, just an inch or two, to peer out into the frozen void. The snow reflected the moonlight like crushed glass, and the prairie, usually full of rustles and chirps, lay quiet, as if considering turning into an ocean. It was then that he saw them, tracks in the snow, small and neat. A rabbit perhaps, or something, bolder. Life going on, boldly hopping past covered wagons and shivering humans and dreams waiting for spring. Silas let the flap fall closed and turned back toward his family. His wife handed him what might have been broth, and he took it without complaint, warming his fingers on the tin. Outside, the lull had passed. The wind began again, gentler now, like a lullaby played on a cracked fiddle. It swayed the wagon slowly, like a cradle carrying forgotten dreams, rocked not by hands, but by time itself. And somewhere out there, past the snowdrifts that reached toward the stars, the dawn was already considering stretching its golden arms over the prairie. But that, as it turns out, is another dream entirely. The wind was less a whisper and more of a conversation that couldn't decide whether to grumble or gossip. Inside the covered wagon, it expressed itself in a series of persuasive groans, like a violin string being tuned by an indecisive cat. The canvas top, drawn tight over, its wooden bows billowed and creaked with each gust. A rhythmic seesaw of cold air pressing in and old canvas pushing back. It was snowing so hard that the world outside had vanished. No prairie, no trail, no sun nor shadow. Just a white nothing, smothering sound and scent alike. You might call it peaceful if you didn't have to worry about things such as freezing to death or losing all of your molasses to the frost gods. Inside the wagon, the mood was cozy chaotic. Small Charlie was bundled in 3 layers of scratchy wool, only his nose sticking out like a brave little beagle. The nose twitched occasionally, not from cold, but from the smell of onions, because Mrs. Tuttle had insisted on frying some on the wagon stove to warm the air with flavour. The result was an aromatic war between human comfort and tear-stinging eye assault. Now, the wagon stove was not a standard luxury. Most wagons didn't tolerate fire within. Call it a conflict of interest between flame and wood. But the Tuttles had found a tiny cast-iron contraption, barely the size of a lunch pail, and with a trembling optimism, shoved it in one corner. A vent had been jerry-rigged through the canvas roof with a pipe, some prayer, and a strategically placed soup ladle. It sputtered now, grumbling like an elderly man commenting on politics. That was their fire. Weak but loyal, like a pocket-sized Labrador retriever. From time to time, someone would tap the canvas to knock off snow piling on the roof, lest it collapse under the weight. This task rotated among the family, which meant everyone did it, but also everyone complained about doing it. Thus, it remained perfectly balanced. Outside, the oxen stood in their makeshift snow cocoon, heads down against the wind, steaming like furry teapots. They were draped with burlap and blessed with a stoic temperament. Unlike horses, oxen did not fret. They simply endured, which made them the perfect companions for situations in which nature questioned your life choices one snowflake at a time. Inside, the mood turned philosophical. Tempted by boredom or frostbite, hard to tell which, Uncle Silas began recounting tales of his youth. These often involved dramatic episodes of near death involving improperly prepared squirrel meat or trousers frozen solid in mid-stride. "You look death in the eyes," he intoned, and sometimes he just nods because he's particularly busy that week. Little Charlie blinked, awed. "Did he ever actually take you?" he asked in a whisper. "Well, not yet," replied Silas, thoughtfully stirring his cup of boiled chicory that wished it were coffee. "But I like to think he's keeping tabs." Meanwhile, Ma Tuttle attempted to read from a devotional tract, her voice calm and grainy like wind through cornstalks. She was occasionally interrupted by the flapping of canvas or a loud sneeze that echoed like a pistol shot. Each time, she'd pause and raise an eyebrow as if daring the storm to do better. The blizzard whirled onward outside, unseen but deeply felt. Snow piled against the wheels until only the hubs were visible. Somewhere behind the curtain of white, the prairie sighed beneath its blanket, the grass shivering in silence. Time slowed. Meals were simpler, conversations quieter, and the air inside the wagon thickened with a kind of winter meditation. No one rushed. There was nowhere to go, and if there had been, you wouldn't have seen it anyway. As the wind hissed its lullaby between the wood slats, even the oxen began to drowse, standing like statues carved from frozen breath, and those within the wagon listened to the hiss and whisper, the creak and pop, all narrating the same old tale of pioneers and progress, of just how many things humans would do to stubbornly remain indoors. Even the youngest travelers began to nod off, nested in quilts and woolen hope, adrift on clanking wheels that, for now, weren't going anywhere. But beyond the canvas walls and snowy stillness, something stirred, a sound not of wind but of movement. Hoofbeats, maybe, or perhaps only the memory of them, just enough to make you wonder as you drifted off who else might be out there, braving the cold. Snowflakes the size of $half floated lazily from a sky the color of old pewter. Inside the wagon, time had slowed to a drowsy crawl, not just because of the blizzard howling like a peevish banshee across the prairie, but because Pa had committed the greatest crime of frontier parenting. running out of stories. It had happened somewhere between Nebraska Territory and the edges of whatever came next. Pa simply trailed off mid-sentence about a desolate prospector and said, "Well now, that might be all I've got." A silence thicker than corn mush fell over the wagon. There were frigid drafts sneaking in through the seams in the stitched canvas above, but you wouldn't dare lift the flap to explore. That kind of curiosity was for spring, or at least for March, when you could squint into the wind without immediately regretting your general decisions in life. Ma, ever practical and wrapped in 3 petticoats and the Lord's forgiveness, knit silently in the corner. It was the same scarf she'd been knitting for 3 days and would continue to knit until the end of the decade, or until the yarn won that particular standoff. Across from her, old Grandpappy Birds, who claimed to have once outrun a flash flood on a donkey cart, was playing a harmonica tune so slow and mournful that even the beans stopped simmering respectfully. The cows, hitched a little ways back, were not enjoying any of this. See, in a blizzard, everyone becomes philosopher and prisoner alike. The covered wagon, for all its creaking charm and hard-bred ambiance, turns inward, a chapel of shared misery and pot-boiler sausages. The walls, thin enough to hear the buffalo snort on a clear moonless night, swelled with boredom and muffled gossip. "How many days has it been?" one of the children whispered, eyes wide with the ancient desolation known only to those who've been inside a canvas box with their entire extended family and no stories. "About a week," Ma muttered, unlatching her knitting with the force of a woman who'd faced childbirth during a prairie thunderstorm. 3 days, Pa corrected gently, in the tone of a man trying not to get beaned with a sock. To pass the time, strange things began to happen, like games of Whose Foot Is That and Guess That Potato. Neither were very good games, but then again, neither was freezing to death. Outside, the wind whipped between the slats and bundles, performing what historians would later describe as enthusiastic percussion. One can only imagine how many romantic thoughts were quashed amidst the crescendo of ropes groaning and oxen expressing deep existential angst. But here's the quiet triumph of the era. People didn't just survive this, they made it normal. They accepted that sometimes the road west went on pause, that the trail became less of a journey and more of a waiting room. A long, creaking, goose-down-lined waiting room, where one might embroider for 6 hours straight and still count it toward one's chores. Remarkably, some even found joy in the confinement. Little Homer, whose job had been to collect firewood, but was known to return with only philosophical questions about squirrels, had taken to inventing card games with just 3 cards and 23 made-up rules. No one else could win, but since he also couldn't remember his own rules the next day, it remained a diplomatic stalemate. And then there was Aunt Mary Beth, who during one particularly long gale, composed a 3-verse ballad about the flour sack that fell into the stew without asking anyone's permission. The chorus rhymed bleached muslin with unrepentant tussle, which you may think is impossible, until you too are snowed in with only a fiddle, tea made of pine needles, and ambition. Nights were strangest of all. The cold pressed in quietly, a velvet hammer from the outside world. Blankets shared between knees and elbows, the brother's head on the cousin's chest. Not cuddle, just logistics. And yet, there was something sacred there too. Beneath the canvas dome, each gust outside underscored this truth. Together was survivable. Sleep came fitfully, like a neighbor sneaking in through the back door, but it came, lulled by the wind's hissing sermons and the heat from one another, The family folded into dreams. Somewhere in the distance, the wind shifted, just slightly. Less fierce protest, more tired sigh. And as the snowpack sighed into softness, Homer quietly suggested to no one in particular, maybe tomorrow we'll see sky. But for tonight, warm breath clouding the lamplight, the wagon rested, still and snug beneath its drifted cape of white. The wind that night had the voice of a disapproving aunt, sharp, persistent, and slightly nasal as it rattled against the wagon's canvas covering with the enthusiasm of someone trying to share unsolicited opinions through a closed window. Inside the wagon, it sounded less like howling and more like an argument between ghosts trying to agree on who forgot to pack the extra socks. Jonas, the weary patriarch of our imaginary pioneers, was lying flat on a bed of itchy wool blankets atop hay that had ambitions of being comfortable, but ultimately insisted on poking him in strategic locations, an elbow here, a kidney there. He stared up at the wooden slats of the wagon's roof and contemplated life's pressing questions such as, why did chickens always look so smug? And did socks deserve the widespread reverence they now held in frozen America? Around him, the family had settled into their usual nocturnal arrangement, a human puzzle box with limbs in various states of surrender. Little May, age 5 and constantly sticky with an unexplained molasses residue, lay curled up next to her brother Ned, age 10, who had perfected the art of breathing heavily just enough to cause mild concern, but not enough to be classified as alarming. The blizzard outside went about its business. Snowflakes smashed valiantly against the wagon's canvas with the determination of stagecoaches trying to catch a connecting train. To the untrained ear, it was chaos. But to those with deeper sensitivities or sleep-deprived hallucinations, it resembled a symphony of frost. The snow whispered fiddle tunes over the wheel hubs, tapped flirtatiously at the iron stove's chimney pipe, and sang a lilting ballad to the oxen huddled beneath their blankets of steam and resignation. The oxen, bless them, were not thrilled by the arrangement. Cuddling had not been in their job description, and neither had frozen nostrils. Their job was to pull, grunt, and occasionally look noble in paintings. Tonight, they simply breathed puffs of bovine mist and cast judgmental glances toward the wagon, the way cats might if they were four-footed leviathans. Meanwhile, at the foot of the wagon, where winters were hardest and toes most vulnerable, Clara, our middle child and spiritual representative of all passive-aggressive optimism, wrapped her shawl tighter and whispered a bedtime prayer for warmer days, or at least thicker mittens. She kept a journal under her pillow, where she'd attempted to catalogue each snowflake she'd seen that year. So far, she believed she'd counted 14, each meticulously described as twirly and impolite. Food smells lingered from earlier, as they often do in cold weather. A stew of beans, salted pork, and wishful thinking had been consumed hours before, but somehow the aroma hung about like a ghost with unfinished snacks. When the wind dipped just right, it dragged that scent back up into noses, conjuring up phantom bites and surprising tummy gurgles from even the deepest sleepers. One of the more peculiar sounds of the evening came from the wagon wheel, wooden, reliable, and, unbeknownst to most, a fervent critic of cold weather. As the temperature dropped, it creaked audibly every few minutes. Not the frightened squeak of something breaking, no. It was a weary, long-suffering groan. The kind of noise grandparents make when settling into armchairs or when someone uses the word hashtag in casual conversation. Inside the wagon, the family had developed an odd sleep symphony. Jonas's occasional snore acted as the bass, while May's intermittent sleep-talking provided unpredictable high notes. Clara contributed the murmured sounds of diary entries being composed in dreams, and outside, the wind kept time. A soft cymbal crash here, a ragtime shudder there. The storm showed no signs of letting up. In fact, it seemed to have invited some friends, specifically drifts of snow that threatened to overwhelm the wheels and whispers of frost that slid like gossip across every inch of canvas. But the warmth inside the wagon, humble though it was, stood defiant. Body heat, scratchy blankets, and the shared breath of a family tangled in mutual proximity created a stubborn pocket of comfort. Even as the wind sighed and the snow plotted, the family drifted further into sleep, each dream stitched with threads of warmth, home, and an occasional longing for bacon that hadn't been dried for 3 months. Tomorrow, the snow may rise higher. The axes may need their sharpening, and someone, likely Jonas, would have to explain to the oxen why they couldn't ride inside the wagon too. But for now, in this frosted wagon surrounded by white silence and woolly dreams, time stood still, and beyond the edge of sleep, another sound began to emerge, the quiet creaking of a door somewhere in memory, swinging open into what came next. Snowflakes in a blizzard do not fall. They fly, tumble, gallop sideways in a kind of civil disobedience against the general rules of gravity, especially when seen from within a covered wagon, where gravity is already a negotiable concept, thanks to the layer of frost creeping politely toward your blanket-wrapped toes. By now the storm had stopped teasing and begun performing. The wind shrieked across the prairie like a banshee with a clipboard, ticking off every item on its list. Snap tree branches. Check. Send snow flurries through every crack in the wagon canvas despite Pa's best tarp work. Check. Turn the sky the color of cold dishwater and keep it that way until further notice. Big check. Inside the wagon, life had narrowed to the essentials. Warmth, soup, and speculation about whether one's eyelashes could freeze shut while blinking. The canvas groaned against each gust, the creaking wood performing a private sonata composed entirely by Mother Nature and panic. And yet, amidst all this frosty turmoil, was something strangely cozy. The more the outside world raged like a disappointed opera singer, the more inviting it became to count your blessings. A stew still bubbling on the iron stove, technically just some turnips, fatback, and considerable optimism. 3.5 warm bodies crammed into the wagon, the half being a rather lumpy dog named Dividend who was only conditionally warm. And above all, stories. Nothing passes a howling whiteout quite like storytelling. And because Wi-Fi had not yet been invented, and would not be for roughly 150 years, the pioneers had to get creative. Tonight's tale, offered in the dim orange glow of a lantern, cleverly balanced on an old boot, was one of the family's favorites. The harrowing journey of Great Aunt Esther and her incident involving a buffalo, a broken axle, and one very unfortunate batch of beans. Esther, it was told, once stared down a buffalo with such sheer confidence that the beast reconsidered its whole day, turned around, and walked back into the snow as if late for a meeting. This may or may not have involved a cleverly disguised slingshot and a firm shout of shoo, an act which, if nothing else, earned her a place in family legend and a strong argument for why practical women should always lead the wagon train. Outside, the wind changed direction again, something it did frequently, as if unable to make up its mind. It ricocheted now across the wagon's wooden wheels, sounding remarkably like a choir of ghosts arguing about where they left their mittens. Young Seth, nestled beneath 2 quilts and a restuffed pillow, blinked up at the canvas roof and whispered, "How do snowflakes make it all the way down from the sky if the wind's going sideways?" His father, who had one arm around his wife and another around a dented tin mug of molasses tea, replied without blinking, "Because snowflakes are stubborn, like your Aunt Esther." The others chuckled, the kind of laughter that didn't try to be loud. It didn't want to wake the baby or the storm. Then came the occasional thump. Could have been a clump of snow dislodging from a tree, or yet another squirrel who underestimated the physics of frozen bark. Either way, everyone inside the wagon began to pretend very hard that it was probably nothing. That's something wagons were especially good for, pretending things were probably nothing. Through air frosted thick enough to line a bakehouse, little pockets of heat pulsed in and out of existence. Steam rose from the open stew pot, spun upward, and vanished into the upper shadows of the canvas, where it mingled with the gentle sighs of a kind of forced peace. There's a sound that canvas makes when it's coated in snow, and the wind jiggles in its edges, almost like someone humming very quietly while wearing mittens. It's not a tune exactly, but if you're bundled tightly enough and just a little bit sleepy, it starts to sound like the world breathing deeply in its sleep. Outside, the storm would continue its artistry through the night. But inside the wagon, there were soft hands holding other soft hands, and one person very likely having a dream about hot cider and a rocking chair. Objects currently unavailable, but vividly imagined. And somewhere between stew and snoring dog, the wind shifted once more. Warmer, just a touch. The kind of whispery promise that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow might bring something other than snow, or at least shorter icicles. Someone stirred and murmured, "The wind sounds different now." And indeed it did, as though blowing in something new, or very old. Whatever it was, it would find them soon enough. If you'd pressed your ear to the canvas side of the covered wagon that night, through mittens and mufflers and maybe a bonnet or two, you might have heard the storm debating something important with the prairie. A windhowl war council, perhaps. Whatever it was, both sides were losing their tempers. Inside the wagon, however, things were more diplomatic, mostly because no one wanted to move an inch. Not when every inch stirred up a new cold. The air had a way of sneaking past scarves and socks like it was on a secret mission. And what were cold feet, really, but another form of frontier diplomacy? Ma had long ago given up wrestling with the little stove in the corner, which coughed soot like a consumptive raccoon and always smelled slightly of regret. It hadn't provided warmth so much as gently insulted your expectations, but it did give off a glow, thin and orange like a tired pumpkin. That alone was enough to keep the family's eyes drooping. Pa had filled some stockings with rocks heated earlier in the ember pile, now wrapped like precious heirlooms and tucked near everyone's toes. These were frontier hot water bottles, on the cheaper side of luxury. Nobody questioned how clean the socks were. Everyone agreed not to. The youngest, Lydia, lay swaddled in so many layers, she resembled a quilt burrito. She only popped her head out to ask sleepy questions about snowflakes and frost spirits, questions the midwinter didn't bother answering. Ma responded with stories of icy ladies who danced on rooftops, and Pa muttered something about radical Scandinavian folklore. Over near the canvas flap, Great Aunt Moira slept bolt upright, as she always did, arms crossed in a way that suggested Victorian judgment. She claimed it was better for the lungs, although nobody had asked her. And besides, her lungs had clearly been forged in the glaciers of Glen Moira. long before America was a twinkle in Thomas Jefferson's eye. The oxen outside, meanwhile, did their best impressions of sleeping boulders. Wrapped in snow that looked suspiciously like second-hand whipped cream, they exhaled warm mist clouds, each sigh a reminder that even beasts weren't thrilled about pioneering in December. From inside the wagon, you couldn't tell what hour the clock thought it was. Time folded around the flakes like a hand-stitched blanket. Stars were absent. Some said they checked out before the storm began, but it didn't matter. Nobody aboard could tell you what day of the week it was, let alone the time. Only that it was long after supper, and before anything sensible ever happens. Somewhere in the crowded quilt nest, Uncle Eli narrated his dreams out loud. They leaned heavily on Outlaw's soup and losing one's hat at inconvenient moments. These were common themes. The rest of the family had gradually learned to fold his ramblings into their own dreams, accepting their fate to ride into a softly bubbling pot of story stew each night. Not that anyone was truly asleep, not deep down. Sleep on the frontier wasn't a full surrender. It was more of a cautious agreement. It meant, I'll let my muscles rest, but my ears are on call. Because nobody wanted to be ambushed by freezing rain or a raccoon with poor boundaries. As the wagon timbers gave occasional polite creaks, wagon speak for quite chilly this evening, isn't it? The family drifted in and out of slumber, lulled by the storm's percussion. Wind tapping the canvas like a fussy woodpecker, snow whispering secrets across the roof, and somewhere, far off, the mournful yip of a coyote wondering why it hadn't moved to Florida. Inside, though, it was warm enough. Not in the sunshiny lemonade sense, but in the we've survived worse and still have jam tomorrow way. A quiet, earned warmth. The kind you built not from bricks, but from shared blankets and half-joked complaints, and knowing someone always turned the sock rocks before bed. The storm roared and sputtered, then roared again, as though proud of its latest snowdrift, and beneath it, burrowed under canvas and communal sighs, the wagon's passengers settled just a fraction deeper into their layered lives, waiting for morning, or a break in the clouds, or maybe just the next lull in the wind. Through one small gap in the canvas, the faintest moonbeam pushed through at last, the pale eye of a reluctant night god, peeking to make sure the family was still intact and generally pointed west. And with that light touch of lunar approval, the dreams continued, blending frontier chores with quiet joys and stitching the storm into memory, one shiver at a time. In the distance, the snowflakes began to tumble slower, as if tired themselves, just as a new sound stirred near the canvas flap. The wind had become a house guest, not the polite sort who delicately knocks with a bottle of cordial before entering, but the kind who barges in uninvited, wearing a snowdrift as a cape, and tracking slush across your best hand-woven floor rug. Inside the covered wagon, under layers of scratchy wool blankets and strategically positioned dogs, the pioneers endured their frosted visitor with all the resignation of people who had technically invited this sort of lifestyle. Outside, the blizzard performed its symphony, the same chords over and over, with snow battering the canvas like a percussionist who dropped his mallets and continued with elbows. The flaps of the wagon strained and slapped in time with the wind's tantrum, which, at that point, had spiraled into one of Wagnerian proportions. While nature's fury howled beyond the thin walls, the family hunched inside was engaged in a quieter, much more suspenseful activity, not freezing to death. Now, the 19th century prairie didn't come with central heating, unless you counted the collective body heat of 2 adults, 3 children, and a terrier with heat-seeking instincts. The children, wrapped in patched-together quilts resembling exploded kaleidoscopes, nestled into each other like cinnamon rolls, who happened to be deeply into survival. Their breath, visible in the frosted interior, rose in synchronized puffs, like tiny steam engines huddled around a coal fire of storytelling and cracker rations. Ma, stern yet soothing, had stationed herself near the wagon's iron stove, a small furnace that predated OSHA by several decades and routinely sparked small domestic dramas when someone ventured too close for warmth. The tin kettle atop it gurgled with boiled prairie water, optimistically masquerading as tea, and the smell, earthy with a hint of regret, wafted through the cold space like a consolation prize. Pa, bundled in more layers than an onion preparing for a masquerade ball, sat whittling a piece of pine into something that might turn into a spoon, God willing and arthritis permitting. His face bore that specific look pioneer men often wore during a storm, part philosopher, part icicle. Through his thick beard, now sparkling with frost like Father Christmas had crash-landed in Kansas, he told the children stories of warmer days, stories where buffalo roamed, rivers shone like ribbon candy, and nobody's toenails turned blue from prolonged snow proximity. Meanwhile, the storm continued educating the wagon canvas in percussion. Now and then, the wind would let out a low moaning wail, as if it, too, was regretting its blusterous choices. Snow gathered around the wagon wheels like gossip in a small town, fast, cold, and difficult to shovel away. Out there, farms disappeared under meringue-like drifts. Fence posts vanished like magic tricks performed by nature's least charismatic stagehand, and any trace of road was buried under the collective guilt of 1,000 snowflakes. Inside the wagon, time warped gently. Hours blurred. Sleep tickled eyelids here and there. The baby, swaddled so thoroughly it resembled a sentient loaf of sourdough, snored softly, little breath puffs matching the kettle's hiss. Even the dog had finally settled, having decided that Ma's ankles were warmer than the disillusioned chickens huddled near the axle outside. Historically speaking, these wagons were not designed for comfort. They were designed for movement, like riverboats with wheels and more arguments. But when the prairie turned into a parody of Siberian exile, the covered wagon morphed into a kind of shallow submarine, submerged in snow, fluttering cloth, and muffled prayers. And yet, inside the family persevered. The secret, of course, was that while the blizzard played its angry solo outside, the real warmth came from within. From wool mittens stitched by candlelight, from weather-worn lullabies sung in cracked voices, from Pa's terrible jokes delivered just convincingly enough to draw giggles from frostbitten children. That, and the emergency lard. As sleep stole gently over them, the wind yanked once more at the canvas, and then receded, momentarily sated. Perhaps it had run off in search of another bluff to bully. Inside, the storm quieted into white noise, and the family began to melt into their dreams one by one, as icicles lengthened like punctuation outside, long and silent and glistening. And with the wagon wrapped in snow and the prairie wrapped in darkness, a new sound began to whisper on the edge of the frozen silence. Hooves crunching softly across the crusted drifts, but not the horses they knew. Someone, or something, was stirring beyond the veil of the storm. The blizzard had not ended, not in the dramatic storybook way where the sun suddenly breaks through and birds reappear like they'd just been waiting behind a curtain. No, this storm lingered like a bored aunt, sipping lukewarm tea and refusing to take the hint. Inside the covered wagon, The world had condensed into a humble cocoon of canvas, quilts, and quiet prayers that the socks drying near the hearthstones wouldn't catch fire. The wind outside howled like a chorus of grumpy grandmothers, each rattling a different pot or pan across the sky. Snow filtered in through tiny seams in the wagon, not in heaps, but in ghostly little flurries, like the storm had sent scouts just to spy on how its victims were holding up. Sarah Turner, matron of the Weary Turner family, was hunched near the tiny fireproof sand stove they'd managed to jimmy into something resembling cooperation. She was attempting to boil something nutritious out of beans, bacon grease, and what was hopefully not bark. Cooking during a whiteout was something of an act of faith, both in one's flavor instincts and in whatever God you hoped might deliver you salt. The children had made a game of the snow's moaning. They were keeping a tally of the different tones the wind took: sad cow, surprised owl, angry mule, and possibly a confused accordion, though that one was more disputed. The game had helped them ignore the fact that their toes, stuffed into hand-me-down boots and 3 generations of wool socks, had gone from tingling to just existing somewhere else entirely. Beside them, their father Jacob had taken to reading aloud from the family Bible, not so much for religious instruction as for the simple magic of rhythm and distraction. His baritone voice hummed through the wagon like a cello caught in a very long conversation. Between verses, he'd drift into weather speculation that would have made modern meteorologists clutch their pearls. "Sky's got that peculiar shade of 'don't bother arguing,'" he said once, confidently, staring out a flap of canvas that showed nothing but white existential blankness. "Means will either freeze or not." And then there was the matter of the wagon wheels. You may not think a good wagon wheel can betray you, but in winter, everything creaked. The wooden spokes dried and shrank slightly, and even tightly wedged iron rims could slip or crack. One of the Turner's wheels had begun giving off a suspicious chirp, a sort of wooden complaint, as if it were considering joining the choir of groans outside. It was a small sound, but in the quiet spells between gusts, it felt like a declaration of war. Jacob had inspected it earlier with his gloves off, which immediately earned him angry looks from Sarah and a throbbing redness in all 10 fingers. The verdict: the wheel wasn't broken, yet, much like Jacob's patience. Meanwhile, somewhere beneath a pile of quilts and something that may have once been a raccoon hat, Grandma Eunice was still asleep. She had only stirred once to announce, with air of deep certainty, that blizzards are just the Great Spirit shaking out a sky blanket. A vague, possibly meaningful statement, which had since become family legend. No one wanted to wake her because, frankly, she seemed to be handling this entire storm better than the wagon's suspension system. What one began to realize after enough hours inside a pioneer wagon during a snowstorm was that time, like beans, could be stretched in unnatural ways. Chores were done slowly. Words said were echoed. Even laughter took its time, drifting up in lazy curls of sleepy mirth. The dog, Banjo, had cleverly figured out how to position himself between the 3 warmest family members without drawing attention. He pretended to be asleep, but judging from the way his ear twitched at every food-related sound, he was merely biding his moment. Dogs, as it turns out, had long been experts in weathering both literal and emotional tempests. It was now the sort of night when the kerosene lamp began to sway ever so slightly, dancing to the lull of the wind. Sarah put away the pot of gruel, thick, gloopy, and proud of itself. The children finally leaned against one another in a heap of wool and stories half finished. Overhead, the wind began to change its tone again. Not louder, not softer, just different, as though it too was tiring of its own performance. Jacob, under his breath and mostly to the stove, said, "Feels like it might be easing." Of course, on the prairie, that could mean anything between "the storm is over" and "we've just begun," intermission. But for now, inside that canvas cocoon, life had shrunk to something manageable. Tomorrow, perhaps, someone would open the flap. For now, the wind would sing them to sleep. And far beyond the whiteout, a spark of sunlight might have already begun to peek its way past the edges of the storm. It was a curious thing, waking up in a covered wagon after a night of howling blizzard winds that had made the canvas roof shudder like a kettle on the edge of a boil. Morning arrived without much visual fanfare, just a brighter shade of grey leaking through the flaps, as though the sky itself were hung over and not quite ready to open its eyes. Inside the wagon, it was somewhere between larder and livestock shed. The bread was stiff, cheeks were pink with chill, and someone's foot was still pressed firmly against someone else's ribs, which is apparently what counted as sleeping arrangements among travellers in 1847. Every breath puffed out in little clouds, like the wagon was full of polite ghosts listening in, waiting for the coffee water to boil. The storm had left its mark. Snow piled up on the windward side of the wagons like poorly thought-out battlements. And in the small gaps where fabric met wood, the wind had stuffed in icy fingers during the night, the kind of cold that respectfully announces itself with numb toes and then settles right into your bones like an in-law overstaying their welcome. Still, there was something oddly peaceful about the quiet that followed. The storm had screamed itself hoarse, and now the world outside was muffled under a down blanket of snow, the kind that hushes everything. Your worries, your calendar, your recollection of how toes are supposed to feel. The oxen, those stoic yogurt-coloured beasts, stood knee-deep in snow, blinking slowly as if weighing the philosophical merits of existing at all. They looked like they might reasonably turn to you and say, "Honestly, this westward expansion thing was your idea." But there was work to do, even in moments of woolly serenity. Fires had to be coaxed back to life using kindling that had been stored in what pioneers generously referred to as dry spots, mostly under benches, quilts, or inside someone's imagination. Hardtack was retrieved and gnawed on like a shared act of defiance, and coffee, thick, brackish, and gritty enough to exfoliate your molars, was passed around like communion. In truth, this slow, frostbitten morning was one of the easier ones. The storm had passed, and while it had robbed everyone of a night's sleep and at least 3 fingers' worth of circulation, it hadn't taken any lives or wagons. In the ledger of settler life, that was counted as a win. One family's rooster, however, had not taken it well. Somewhere during the night, he decided to roost not on a beam or perch, but directly inside a boot, presumably in search of existential answers. He clucked angrily now with one leg covered, in lard and feathers plastered in a way that suggested he'd been rethinking his life choices, which, to be fair, was quite on theme for everyone else. As the camp slowly thawed into life, the children emerged from wagons wrapped in more layers than a winter onion. They stumbled into the light like newly hatched birds, blinking at the snowdrifts that had turned their familiar trail into something out of a fairy tale. One child, with the solemnity of a prophet, declared that they had now officially reached the North Pole, and another offered to dig for walruses using a spoon. Mostly, though, people were quiet. The snow had covered not just the trail, but the noise of the trail, the squeak of wheels, the family arguments over whether or not bacon counted as a vegetable, and even the ceaseless creak of worn-out knees. There was a certain kind of hush you only get from a fresh snow, spiritual if you're the type, or just acoustically practical if you prefer. And in the midst of this sleepy white stillness, somewhere between frost-laced breath and a refilled mug of the world's most ambitious coffee substitute, there came a laugh, a real one, soft, unguarded. It started in one wagon and was answered in another. Not loud, but enough to remind everyone that they were still very much human, despite the wool and the weariness. Small victories. That was the shape of survival, really. And as the morning settled into afternoon, boots were laced up, wagon tongues aimed westward again, and the tracks of their wheels began carving a fresh path through the snow. After all, someone had to go ahead and find out whether the next river crossing would be frozen, or just cold enough to ruin your week. Outside, the wind howled like a disgruntled librarian shushing the Great Plains with intensified fervor. Inside the covered wagon, however, it was more of a muffled scolding, less shrill, more atmospheric, like trying to discipline a toddler through a feather pillow. The Ingalls family, and many like them, had become accidental connoisseurs of wagon acoustics. They could distinguish wind speeds by how the canvas flapped. A gentle flutter meant supper could be cooked with minimal frostbite. A thrashing rip would require not only wool mittens, but perhaps some prayers, and possibly a shovel. You see, in the mid-1800s, somewhere between, "Oh, manifest destiny sounds fun," and "Why is the sky spitting knives?" pioneers faced what can only be described as nature's deeply inconvenient flair for drama. A winter blizzard on the prairie came without ceremony. One moment, a calm afternoon pipe smoke drifted lazily past a family dog named Buttons. The next, Buttons was unrecognizable under 20 pounds of snow and mild existential dread. Covered wagons, with their curved canvas tops stretched over wooden bows, looked like upside-down ship hulls. Fitting, because traveling the American frontier was a bit like sailing the world's flattest ocean, waves of grass instead of water, and far fewer sea shanties. Imagine it. A family of 5 huddled under buffalo hides, cornmeal mush congealing in a tin bowl, and somewhere outside, a wind not unlike the sound of a ghost dragging a bassoon. On nights like this, steam curled up from breath like spectral campfire smoke, trailing into the shadows of the wagon roof. The children, usually 2 parts play and 1 part sticky, now clumped together for warmth, wrapped in a tangled pile of patchwork quilts at each other's feet. A sturdy iron pot swung slightly from its hook by the axle, the remnants of yesterday's stew still clinging with mysterious resolve. What did you do during a blizzard in a covered wagon? Absolutely nothing, which of course takes a great deal of practice. They had reading, yes. If the lamp oil held, Ma might read a psalm with the voice of a woman determined not to shiver it into Morse code. The Bible doubled as reading material, mattress support, and on truly desperate nights, an insulator between crusty biscuits and the floor. Lit by lamplight, dimmer than a shy firefly, the words became comfort more than content, a kind of ritual chant to hold the storm at bay. But sometimes, the snow came too fast, and with too much sass, and lamps were snuffed out to conserve oil, or to keep the shadows from swinging too bold across the canvas. In these moments, storytelling became the chosen magic. Pa would settle back, his breath fogging the air like a pipe he didn't own, and begin with something like, "Did I ever tell you about the time I outran a jackrabbit on foot?" He hadn't, of course. Jackrabbits remain undefeated in all known foot races. Still, the children leaned in. The stories told during winter storms were like lanterns in the frosted dark, flickering, golden, and suspiciously embroidered. Tales of misbehaving pigs, a snowshoe that doubled as a sled, that one uncle who accidentally proposed to a coat rack in a town called Belforche. None of it strictly true, all of it necessary. Outside, snow pressed against the canvas like a curious stranger at a window. The sound was not sharp, but insistent, the padded hush of 1,000 frozen moths landing at once. This was the sound of a blizzard from inside a covered wagon, a steady, slow heartbeat of wind and drifting snow, broken by the occasional creak of stretched timber or the sigh of someone remembering warmer nights. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried out. Less of a howl, more of a strongly worded suggestion. The horses shuffled, heads bowed against the cold, their breath coiling in the air like sleepy dragons too polite to be threatening. The oxen, ever philosophical, simply stood like massive, immovable beanbags, undisturbed by time or temperature. Inside, the crockery jiggled when the wind hit just right, a ceramic percussion ensemble with terrible rhythm. And yet each clang told the same story as the snowstorm itself. We are still here, blanketed in frost, muffled in wool. The wagon became a kind of living time capsule, inching across the white silence of another frontier night. And just somewhere beyond that silence, nestled between the snowdrifts and squeaky wagon axles, waited the promise of morning. Softly, as if invited by the quiet itself, the wind began to shift. And with it, something peculiar and new. The wind had never learned indoor voice etiquette, especially not on the American prairie in January. If you've ever wondered what it sounds like to be inside a wooden shoebox, hurtling through a white cloud made of frozen knives, well, a covered wagon in a blizzard comes close. As the storm threw icy tantrums across the endless plains, the canvas top above the travelers shuddered like a very anxious drum. The wagon creaked in reply, doing its best impression of an old man sighing through a field of corn husks. Inside the wagon, the family huddled together like a casserole of blankets. Long, John's, and mutual, unspoken doubt. That's how most nights on the trail went in winter. Not necessarily with terror, but with a persistent low-grade wondering of, whose idea was this again? You'll be surprised to learn these brave souls chose it. They chose the rickety wagon, the wild uncertainties, and yes, the howling blizzards. Not so much for adventure, and certainly not for the cuisine, which consisted that evening of slightly suspicious salt pork and a puck of bread that could deflect musket fire, but for a dream of land, liberty, and livestock not yet dead. As the wind tested every knot in the wagon cover, the family kept their spirits up the only way humans knew how, by distracting each other with stories, songs, and a little communal denial. Ma, who had once sung opera in a traveling theatre troupe before marrying into a life of strategic misery, sang lullabies in a voice still honey smooth, even when muffled by wool. Father, with a beard fashioned mostly out of regrets and weatherproofing, shared tales from his youth. Most were probably lies, but they were warm lies, and that counted for something in the great ledger of prairie evenings. As he talked about a winter back east that froze a horse in its tracks, foot up like it was prancing, the children giggled and yawned and sniffled into each other's shoulders. One child, young Nathaniel, sat slouched beneath 3 shawls and a military surplus cap 3 sizes too large. He stared at a knot in the wagon's wooden beam, the same knot he'd stared at for about 4 hours the night before. He imagined it was the eye of a great buffalo spirit watching over them, or possibly a chupacabra, depending on his mood. Either way, it helped take his mind off the fact that the corner of his left boot had turned into a very public swimming pool. The blizzard never properly arrived. It just slowly took the world, minute by crunchy minute. First the light, reduced to a dim blue glare that made it feel like they were inside a snow globe belonging to a particularly sullen god. Then the ground, buried under drifts that swallowed the wagon wheels so completely, you wondered if they'd roll at all come morning. Then the sounds, leaving only wind, canvas, breath, and the occasional thump of a determined snowflake trying to break in. And yet, there was a strange comfort to it. Huddled inside, the travellers became their own little world. A gelatinous, steaming mass of human resilience in a burrito of flannel and freeze-induced clarity. Meanwhile, outside, the oxen stood under a crude canvas lean-to, chewing slowly, eyes half closed in bovine meditation. Despite conditions that would buckle lesser beasts, they endured, plotting nothing and expecting less. The oxen had long ago accepted that winter was a test you neither fought nor studied for. You just survived it, patient as mud. Among travellers, a few tricks had developed over the years. Placing heated bricks under blankets brought a kind of joy that only someone cold enough to bite their own teeth could understand. Socks stuffed with hay, flint-warm tins of beans tucked near the ribs. Prairie sleeping was not glamorous, but it was undeniably inventive. And there, nestled among the quiet groans of wood and the wind, stories soft as wool filtered out, one by one. Of a spring that would certainly be green this time. Of lakes with fish that volunteered for supper. Of houses that didn't move, didn't leak, and didn't host raccoons by surprise. As the night tiptoed forward and the snow danced harder against their makeshift home, a kind of peace, slow, stubborn, winter-earned peace, settled over the wagon. It hummed through the floorboards and sighed through the quilts. The blizzard would rage on as blizzards do, but the family had become practiced listeners of its lullaby. And just east of their fading fire pit, buried in snow, the edge of an old boot peeked out, a remnant of a traveller who hadn't listened quite so well to the wind's warnings. But that's a tale the morning might whisper, if one is still and quiet enough to hear it. The wind that night made a sound like a violin left out in the snow, if violins could shiver. It slithered through the seams of the canvas wagon cover, curling around the sleeping forms inside like a curious, frozen cat. Outside, snowflakes the size of a biscuit cook's regrets fell silently, but with purpose, puffing onto the prairie in great billowing heaps. From beneath the buffalo hides and stitched-up quilts, the world sounded distant, like a half-remembered lullaby played on ice. Inside that wagon, huddled in layers of wool and whispered prayers, the Sanders family were engaged in a time-honored frontier pastime, pretending everything was just fine. Pa had stuffed more corn husks into the drafty edges of the wagon cover earlier in the day, which was really just the 1850s version of duct tape. Ma placed warm potatoes at their feet before bed, baked in the morning fire and wrapped in flannel. Little ovens for the toes. The children, numb from both cold and yet another bedtime story about Daniel Boone, were buried like treasured root vegetables beneath the bedding. All of them, except maybe Pa, were quietly wondering the same thing. Why had people voluntarily left places with actual walls? The truth was, this kind of weather was more common than not across the Great Plains. Winter storms didn't ask. They simply arrived, usually on horseback made of air and spite. Some were quick tempests with a flair for drama, but others, like this one, settled in for a long, awkward visit. Early travellers called them northers, or sometimes blue northers, a name that sounded like the sort of folk tune you weep into your hat about. These northerly fronts could drop temperatures by 30 degrees in an hour and paint your moustache white before you could say, "Where did the livestock go?" But perhaps the quietest secret of these prairie blizzards was how oddly peaceful they could be from the inside. Outside, yes, you'd find the full spectacle. Wind throwing tantrums, snow flinging itself sideways, prairie chickens dropping mid-flight in what must have been polite protest. But inside the wagon, wrapped deep in furs and familial resignation, strangers to this land could pretend they understood something ancient. The storm became a sort of sleeping song, the canvas cover drumming gently like a lullaby written by wolves. Conversation dropped off, and breaths started sinking to the rhythm of the storm. Long, slow, and steamy like a kettle preparing tea for one. Occasionally, someone muttered about sealing the seams with beeswax, or mentioned a cousin who'd spent a night in a corn crib and lived to tell the tale. Mostly, though, it was the kind of silence only a snowstorm and mild frostbite could inspire. At one point, old Nellie the mule sneezed loudly from just outside the wagon, sending snow off her canvas shelter in a powdery burst. It was a noise both comically human and devastatingly disappointed, as if even she was ready to file a travel complaint with the nearest administrative body of weather. Still, warmth ticked up slowly. The wagon's floor, layered with hay, helped. So did Pa's beard, which, after 2 weeks without shaving, had become structurally helpful. At least 2 toddlers were using it as a small blanket. And as the moon disappeared behind snow-thick sky, sleep began to settle over the wagon like a quilt laid by night itself. Historical records tell us that pioneers often judged the coming weather by the behavior of their animals, how the draft horses stood or whether the chickens fluffed up. But once a blizzard was on you, no predicting mattered. You were in it, like soup in a pot. Eventually, the wind dipped into a gentler whistle. The storm wasn't relenting, merely humming differently, less furious, more focused. It was during this lull that Ma, half awake but still maternal by instinct, nudged Pa with her elbow. "Did you tie the wagon down tight?" Pa, not opening his eyes, made a noise like a man being asked if he'd remembered to invent the automobile. The wagon shuddered softly against the blast of another gust, and all 5 family members murmured under their breath in collective chilly spirituality. Outside, the blizzard continued to compose its frozen symphony, and somewhere out beyond the edge of the prairie, the stars, utterly unaware, began clicking back into place behind the clouds. A rolling gust curled its fingers under the wagon's canvas flap, rattling it softly like a sleepy child fussing with a blanket. Inside, the Lambert family was arranged in a living puzzle of elbows, woolen socks, and the low groan of someone shifting atop a barrel of flour, repurposed as a pillow. The wind outside had taken on its most recent imitation. This time, lonesome train wailing beneath layers of ice that hadn't yet been invented. A blizzard in full swing was, paradoxically, not terribly eventful by the time you were in your 3rd hour of it. The screaming winds mellowed into background music for the evening's indoor activities. Wool mending, biscuit chewing, and the slow art of trying not to mention that the potatoes were nearly gone. It was the 19th of God knows what month, and time on the trail had become a thing told only by the lantern wick's length and the trajectory of everyone's patience. Outside, prairie grasses surrendered to drifts a foot high and rising. The family's oxen, tucked beneath a crude windbreak fashioned from a discarded plough, and someone's deeply regretted attempt at a homemade sailcloth, huddled close as bovinely possible without initiating a minor civil disagreement among themselves. The fire had long since been banked beneath a structure that looked like it was constructed by drunk squirrels, but somehow it held. Its low glow pooled against the canvas, like amber light on soft cotton. It was almost enough to forget that everyone's toes felt like half-cooked beans. 10-year-old Abigail, clutching a doll made of corn cob and leftover anxiety, turned to her grandfather. His name was Winfield. His boots were 2 sizes too big, and his storytelling voice carried the panache of someone who once claimed he'd met Daniel Boone's nephew's barber. "Grandpa," she whispered, "what was the loudest storm you ever heard?" Winfield, who had long ago decided that storytelling was a perfect way to delay sleep and possibly avoid dish duty, cleared his throat dramatically. The sound echoed softly against the wagon ceiling, startling a mouse back into the kindling basket. "Well," he said, "it was the spring of '49, the original '49, not the sequel filament, you know, before people started wearing gold as if they invented it." This was a story the family had heard before, but no one interrupted. In the covered wagon theatre, repeats were not just tolerated, they were savoured like leftovers reheated over a word count fire. We were camped just east of Skull Creek, on account of the name being so welcoming and all, he drawled. The clouds came in fast, slick like a barn cat on a greased floor, thunder louder than a judge with belly gas. The wind blew so fierce it rearranged Uncle Clive's hair, and that scalp hadn't seen daylight since Madison was in office. Abigail giggled, clutching her dolly tighter. Her mother sighed, darning socks by lantern light with a kind of slow, exhausted reverence for fabric that had held on longer than most politicians. "But," Winfield continued, his voice softening, "that storm, all bark, no bite. This one," he gestured vaguely at the flapping canvas and wind howls, "this one's the quiet kind. The snow keeps piling, the cold keeps sleeping on our backs, and the wind howls only so we know it's still keeping watch." Mrs. Lambert stirred the embers in the small stove, carefully not letting too much light splash into the corners where the children were trying, and undeniably failing, to drift into dreams. She handed her husband a cup. Tepid water with a hint of cinnamon if you imagined hard enough. Mr. Lambert took a sip that made a ceremonial sigh. "Best thing about being snowed in," he said. "No one can suggest we make more miles tomorrow." There was a general murmur of agreement, followed by the universal frontier lullaby. A long, shared silence, broken only by the occasional sniffle, a flick of ash, and the wind blowing just enough to keep your thoughts interesting, but not enough to make you care. Outside the wagon, the snow continued to sketch its own quiet version of history across the plains. It covered wagon tracks, curled into fences that no longer stood, and painted the landscape with the smooth, undisturbed strokes of time briefly pausing to exhale. As the fire dwindled to soft memory and the wagon creaked a lullaby of its own, the Lambert family sank into a hush that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't entirely waking either. Somewhere in the northern sky, the clouds considered another round of snow, as if curious how deeply comfort could be buried, and how warm it might still be beneath the weight of weather and wool. Tomorrow, of course, would bring more questions. Perhaps even a visitor pulling an unfamiliar sleigh. Early morning on the prairie often began not with sunlight, but with the quiet negotiation of coffee. Mrs. Wadsworth, wrapped in a shawl that could have easily doubled as a circus tent flap, was trying to light the campfire using twigs that displayed all the flammability of boiled cabbage. Her husband, meanwhile, stood nearby, rubbing sleep from his eyes and attempting to look useful. A complex operation that mainly involved holding a tin coffee pot and nodding encouragingly at the fire, but inside the wagon, it was another world entirely. The thick canvas cover of the Conestoga performed better insulation than anybody gave it credit for. It neither repelled snow particularly well, nor trapped heat with flair. But what it did bring to the trail party was a consistent set of prairie acoustics. The wool-muted hush of falling snow, the wind's mournful whistle, and the occasional creak of frozen wood. Like the wagon itself was trying to groan its way back to sleep. Inside, 2 children were wrapped in quilts that smelled comfortably of smoke, flour, and something vaguely goat-like. Henry, who was 9 and considered wise beyond his years because he once read all of Leviticus without falling asleep, was huddled next to his younger sister, Abigail, who firmly believed their family was being stalked by a frost demon named Crackle. No one had corrected her. Their father, James, re-entered the wagon with a whoosh of cold air and a beard dusted with snowflakes, looking like a frontiersman-themed cake topper. "Snow's let up," he whispered. Not because he needed to, but because snow brings its own hush, and shouting into it feels like blasphemy. Supper may be mouldy, but breakfast is a work in progress. The family's sled of a breakfast, hardtack, beans, and something that might have once been bacon, was symbolic of westward expansion, full of promise, incredibly chewier than expected, and lightly smoked by accident. But this morning, there was an unusual energy about the wagon train. Whistles echoed up and down the line, not the frantic kind that meant someone's ox had wandered off again, but the short, cheerful ones that meant good weather, or as good as one could get when the temperature tried to bite off your ears. One of the scout riders had returned bearing news that the snowdrifts weren't as bad as they'd feared, and miracle of miracles, a frozen squirrel had been found atop a tree stump, stiff but still technically edible. Spirits, somewhat like the coffee, rose slowly and with suspicion. The wagon itself groaned as the wheels were unwrapped from thick canvas covers, a ritual akin to pulling cranky boots off a sleeping giant. The boys went out with shovels, which functioned less as tools and more as vague gestures of protest against the snow. Dig here, dig there. Not so much to clear a road, but to convince the oxen that pride was on the line and movement was expected. And the oxen, those noble, half-asleep beasts of burden, stood stoically chewing and blinking into the blizzard light. No animal has ever looked more put upon or more existentially disinterested than an ox at the start of a snowy morning. They accept snow like they accept harnesses and humans and the occasional overly affectionate raccoon, in silence. It was then that someone, perhaps young Samuel Taylor, who was suddenly obsessed with poetry despite never fully conquering the alphabet, began playing a small tin whistle. There was a melody to it, halting and optimistic, like a robin learning public speaking. And do you know what? Others joined. A harmonica here, a warbling voice there, because that's what prairie mornings taught better than any book. That harmony isn't always pretty or in tune, but it keeps the cold from feeling quite so large. Extended families creaked back into motion as wagons crept forward over snow-packed tracks. The white around them cracked and crunched beneath wheels and hooves. Somewhere, someone began reciting a passage from Exodus, because when trudging through endless wilderness, one could do worse than finding companionship in a tale of plagues and sand. Snowflakes still wandered down from the sky, light as dreams and twice as ambiguous. But amongst them, there was motion, life, and a rattling pot that would soon portend lunch. And ahead, just beyond the frost-covered horizon, the wind carried something new, a sound like hammers, gentle ones, rhythmic, and building something. But that, dear dreamer, is a sound best explored in softer light. When the snow gives way to shingles and the scent of sawdust begins to dance with pine. Despite the lashing wind and the endless whirl of snow, the inside of the covered wagon had started to take on an oddly comforting spell, like a heavy woolen quilt of monotony. Each gust was met with the same creak of canvas, the same low mutter from Ma. Something about the beans again. They were always halfway done. They would always be halfway done. There was a rhythm to this kind of winter waiting. Snow piled quietly like years in a diary, unnoticed until it was too heavy to lift. The children had long stopped asking when the blizzard would end. That question had been answered, albeit through proxy, when Pa set down the soup ladle 2 days prior with a firm declaration that weather could, in fact, be personal. "I swear this snow knows what it's doing," he mumbled, glancing out the flapping wagon flap like the blizzard owed him $5 and an apology. Inside, however, the family had developed a sort of cozy stalemate with the elements. The corners were lined with bundled up things, quilts, sacks of flour, a broom no one dared touch lest they be nominated for chore duty. The air was thick with the smell of iron stove warmth, mingled with wood smoke, dried apples, and the unmistakable scent of boiled socks. Someone had thought it a good idea to dry them too close to the kettle, and now the soup had undertones of feet and frontier optimism. Time passed in lumps. Occasionally, someone would hum. Occasionally, that someone would discover it was the same tune they'd been humming yesterday and the day before. Likely some forgotten church hymn, now repurposed as a lullaby for patience. In this cage of canvas and kettle steam, conversation was doled out sparingly, like hard candy at a summer social. Enough to keep spirits up, not enough to cause a stir. "Do you think the snow's getting tired?" piped up the youngest, Susanna, age 6 and professionally inquisitive. Pa leaned back against a barrel of pickles, arms crossed, thinking as seriously as anyone could, who was currently sitting on a squeaky crate of medical supplies. "Reckon it might be. Snow's probably out there thinking, haven't I covered everything already?" Ma, ladling something vaguely edible into a tin cup, raised an eyebrow. "Well, I don't see exhaustion slowing you down when it comes to avoiding the dishes." The older brother, Nathaniel, aged 12 and recently enthroned as the family's foremost sarcasm expert, added solemnly, "The snow and Pa do have a lot in common. Both very white, both everywhere, both seem intent on us not going anywhere." There was general chuckling, which the wagon accepted like a creaky old dog, grateful to hear laughter again. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless whispers. Inside, the silence after the laughter was deep and full, as though the air itself was holding its breath, unsure whether another joke might sneak in. At moments like this, one could almost believe that the covered wagon was floating not on frozen prairie, but instead somewhere quieter, adrift on muffled clouds, carrying a family of odd philosophers towards sleep. They spoke of odd things after dinner, not in schedules or weather patterns, but dreams, the walking, wakeful kind. Sally, the eldest daughter, said she wanted to build a library when they reached the West. That was funny, since the family only owned 6 books, and one of them was mostly pressed flowers. Pa wanted to plant an orchard so wide you could lose your hat in it and never find it again, even if it was a Sunday hat. Ma said, with a smirk hidden beneath her bonnet, that if they ever found a town quiet enough, she'd open a bakery where Tuesdays were solely reserved for pies, and no one, absolutely no one, would call them Mrs., just Mary, like before. Outside, the storm did not listen, but it also didn't interrupt. They fell asleep slowly that night, tucked in tight and pressed together like warm sardines in a canvas sea. The wind howled, but softer now, as though even it had grown tired of its own tantrum. And tucked near the foot of the wagon, with snow curling just outside like the fingers of some great frozen storybook, the little tin cup sat empty, still warm with the ghost of soup and half-spoken dreams. Somewhere beyond the storm, the sun was turning over in its sleep, preparing itself perhaps to return. But for now, the world would stay wrapped in cottony snow, and the family would drift on a white sea of nothingness, dreaming, slowly, deeply, on the edge of something new, with the worst of the blizzard behind them, or at the very least, sulking quietly somewhere out on the prairie. The pioneers inside the canvas-tented hum of the wagon began to take slow, creaky inventory of themselves. There was always a sort of unspoken ceremony to surviving another day in the wilderness, particularly when said day came with sideways snow and an enthusiastic wind that had earlier threatened to remove both eyebrows and hats in a single gust. Now, inside the covered wagon, the world was reduced to a dim glow of filtered daylight, pressing through the waxed canvas walls. The air was crisp, but no longer hostile. The fire outside had finally agreed to stay lit in a makeshift stone circle, and the iron kettle breathed out curls of steam like a small dragon who's finally decided to behave. It was not luxury, but it was life. And for most settlers, life and luxury weren't necessarily separate things. They were synonyms when compared to the alternative. Harriet, the family's unofficial mothership, had roasted a tiny portion of the remaining salt pork, slicing it with the same knife she used for everything from trimming candles to removing buttons from her youngest's mouth. She was largely unfazed by crises, having once calmly sewn a button onto her apron while a neighbor gave birth beside her in a wagon parked adjacent to a buffalo stampede. The children, having discovered that snow was both entertaining and alarmingly edible, had taken to scraping pieces off the inside of the canvas and pretending it was wagon candy. Of course, it mostly tasted like soot and fabric dye, but they didn't mind. Children rarely do when the naming is clever and their tongues are numb. Jonathan, the patriarch in his own unintentionally democratic way, spent the morning trying to unfreeze the wheel axle with hot water and vigorous arguments with the Almighty. "Just a little thaw, O Lord," he muttered, peering into the sleet. "Don't need the whole Exodus, just about 14 inches of lubrication and a good grunt of motivation." Even the oxen, those slow-eyed, philosophical beasts of burden, seemed slightly improved by the weather's retreat into dignity. They blew warm air from their nostrils and blinked at the prairie like bored philosophers who'd been dragged to the symphony and weren't entirely sure why everyone clapped between movements. Inside, time moved molasses slow. The tick of the travel clock, one of the few family heirlooms deemed worthy of its extra weight, clicked with the poise of a butler announcing another course that never arrived. It had been wound 6 times during the storm, more from nervous habit than need, and now chimed gently as if apologizing for all the fuss. Stories began to fill the still air, as they often did when the chores were done and the fire smoked in contentment. Aunt Josephine, who may or may not have been anyone's actual aunt, shared tales of the great winter of 41, when soup froze on the spoon mid-air and a man caught an icicle with his eyelash. These tales were largely impossible, somewhat inaccurate, and deeply beloved. I remember, she said, adjusting her shawl into maximum grandmotherly form. When your Uncle Cornelius used to swear he could smell spring 2 weeks before it arrived, said the horses would twitch their ears at nothing in particular. Turns out, he was mostly just sniffing the neighbor's pickled cabbage, fermenting under the eaves. The laughter that followed was soft but real, like bread baking or the warmth under a quilt stitched from memory. Soon, someone, likely Harriet, began humming an old hymn, the kind where the melody wanders before settling gently back into itself. It was neither dramatic nor especially in tune, but it held the room together like glue made of memory and flour. They sat quietly after that, listening not just to the silence, but to the way it made space for thought. The wind had reduced itself to a distant mutter, the kind that meant the storm was either seriously gone or simply taking a suspiciously long coffee break. In that fragile calm, it was easy to imagine things less cold and more green. Hills not yet seen, rivers that sparkled instead of froze, and a future not yet built but glimpsed just enough to believe in. The prairie, ever mysterious beneath its icy blanket, said nothing to confirm or deny these hopes. And as the sky began to paint itself another color, something between silver and sleep, the pioneers returned their gaze inward, toward dreams, lantern glow, and the promise of morning hooves crunching snow in rhythm with rising bread and warming hearts. They say the wind on the prairie could make a person go mad, not from the sound itself, but from the way it went on and on, like a hymn whose lyrics you never quite remember, but whose tune you can't help humming as you stir beans by lantern light. And during a good old-fashioned frontier blizzard, that wind became the headliner of your evening entertainment, supported by a percussion section of icy sleet and a chorus of ominous creaks from every timber of your covered wagon. Inside one such wagon, let's say it's parked in Nebraska sometime around 1856, a family of 5 is making a memory they'll either forget by spring or tell with increasing exaggeration every Thanksgiving for the next 4 generations. The canvas above them balloons and trembles with every gust, as if trying to lift off into the night without so much as a goodbye note. The rope lashes groan like old knees in cold weather, and packed snow hits the wagon sides with the gentle insistence of a polite thief trying each window with a gloved hand. In the flickering warmth of a tin lantern, boots are steaming and socks are suspended near the heat like primitive pennants of civilization. The floorboards are dusted with snow that snuck in, despite all reason, through seams and stitchings and invisible cracks. A toddler is curled around a corncob doll named Miss Buttercup, dreaming that gingerbread doesn't go stale and ponies nibble sugar cubes straight from your mitten. Ma is darning socks while Pa mutters something about an ox catching cold like a Victorian poet short on metaphors. All the while, a pot of beans bubbles like it's gossiping about everyone in the wagon. No one wants to admit it's the 8th meal this week starring beans as the lead and only actor. But at least they're warm, and mild flatulence isn't considered poor etiquette when it's below freezing. The snow tightens its grip on the world outside, muffling sound until even the wolves stop howling, either from respect or confusion. It's that kind of deep, wool-coated hush that blankets the plains under a spell, as if nature herself pulled the drapes and whispered, "Shh, sleep now." And believe it or not, this was luxury. Sure, your nostrils might stick together when you inhale too sharply, and yes, your hygiene was somewhere between peasant and oops, I forgot I was a human. But to be inside the wagon, under canvas and stars, smelling vaguely of boiled flannel and wood smoke, well, that was a success story by frontier standards. Outside, snow piled like frosting on a layer cake forgotten by a careless baker. The oxen were cloaked in wool and resignation, and tethered to a nearby scrub of cottonwood, chewing cud slowly, as if to say, "We did not sign up for this." But inside, swaddled in quilts and stories, the humans huddled like candles in a drafty cathedral. Of course, this particular family, like many others, survived by the peculiar grace of humour. When Ma's knitting got frosted from her breath, Pa jokingly declared it a new fashion. Ice lace, for the discerning lady who wishes to chime gently when she walks. The children erupted in sleepy giggles, and even the dog wagged once before curling tighter. This was life caught in amber, fragile yet enduring, ridiculous but somehow radiant. Tomorrow, they'd dig out the wagon wheels, break a trail through the drifts, and pretend this night wasn't the coldest any of them could. Remember, time had a way of sanding down the edges of hardship until the past looked quaint and golden, like a daguerreotype with terrible lighting but exquisite moustaches. So the wind howled, the stakes held fast, and the family tucked deeper under the buffalo robes. Night, immense and frosted, settled its weight atop the prairie, and within that aging wooden cart, they dreamed not of cities or fortunes, but of warmer days, steady roads, and beans prepared in at least 2 new and thrilling ways. Sleep inched into their bones like embers hiding in ash, and in the persistent hush of white upon white, they drifted, quietly, deeply, out across the frozen ground, floating gently toward a dawn they hadn't yet met, but somehow trusted would arrive. And so, the blizzard hummed its lullaby, and the wagon, swaddled in snow like the world's most uncomfortable crib, stood sentinel beneath the stars. History turned a page, and dreams, sweet, steaming things, rose like chimney smoke into the waiting dark.